There is a fundamental law embedded deep within human nature, a raw psychological instinct that most leaders spend their entire lives fighting against, only to lose every single time. It is the fierce, almost desperate desire for personal autonomy. The moment a human being feels commanded, forced, or backed into a corner, something deep inside their primal mind snaps shut. It does not matter if your request is entirely logical. It does not matter if your plan is brilliant. The second you issue a direct command, you trigger a defensive reflex that values independence over reason. You are no longer talking to an ally. You're accidentally fighting an ego that would rather watch the entire operation fall apart than blindly submit to your orders. Men look back at the long history of human conflict, from high-stakes corporate boardrooms to quiet domestic arguments. The loudest, most aggressive voice in the room rarely wins true allegiance. Force creates temporary compliance, but compliance is a fragile, bitter substitute for genuine commitment. When you force someone to yield, they might obey you while you are standing right in front of them, but the moment you turn your back, resentment begins to fester deep within their mind. They silently sabotage the outcome, wait for your plan to fail, or execute your directives with half-hearted apathy. Why? Because you stripped away their dignity. You made them feel like an insignificant pawn on your chessboard rather than a valued partner in the mission. Dale Carnegie understood this core truth better than almost anyone in modern history. He observed that human beings are not primarily logical creatures. We are deeply emotional creatures, driven by pride, vanity, self-importance, and above all, the need to feel in control of our own destinies. Carnegie recognized a subtle, dangerous trap that almost every manager, parent, and leader falls into: the illusion of authority. We assume that because we hold a title, a high position, or the moral high ground, people should naturally follow us. But power asserted directly is the moment you display your power overtly, you invite resistance and invite others to challenge your position. And imagine walking into a high-stakes environment, a team that is burned out, rebellious, or fiercely defensive of their own ways. They've seen heavy-handed, demanding leaders come and go. They are prepared for a battle of wills. They fully expect you to raise your voice, lay down strict rules, and demand immediate compliance. But what if, instead of pushing, you completely remove the resistance? What if you understood the psychological machinery of human motivation so deeply that you could guide a person's decisions without them ever feeling a single tug of the leash? This is not about weakness, nor is it about passive conflict avoidance. It is about a high-level psychological shift from brute force to subtle, master-level influence. Master communicators do not demand obedience. They cultivate an environment where cooperation happens naturally. They realize that if you want a tree to grow in a specific direction, you do not physically force the trunk until it snaps. You tilt the dot light so that the tree willingly turns toward it on its own. Amges. Think of the most stubborn person you know, the individual who scoffs at authority, bristles at feedback, and instantly rejects any suggestion that isn't their own. When you try to push that person, their defensive walls go up instantly. Their brain fires off alarm bells, classifying you as a direct threat to their sovereignty. They stop listening to your words and start formulating their counterattack. But when you master the art of indirect leadership, those walls never rise in the first place. You bypass their emotional defenses entirely by appealing to their most powerful subconscious desire, the need to feel important, respected, and entirely in charge of their choices. Leons. The greatest leaders in history were not tyrants. who barked commands from a mountaintop. They were master psychologists who understood that true authority is never taken, it is quietly granted by those who choose to follow. They knew that if an idea originates in someone else's mind, that person will fight to the death to defend it. As we peel back the layers of this human condition, you will begin to see every interaction through a radically different lens. You will realize why your past arguments failed, why your most well-intentioned advice was rejected, and why the hardest people to lead are simply waiting for someone who understands how to unlock their willing cooperation. Okay? The second you issue a direct command, you trigger a defensive reflex that values independence over reason. To bypass this built-in psychological defense, you must master the fundamental habit of master communicators, replacing direct orders with strategic, thought-provoking questions. But when you issue a command, you force the recipient into a submissive posture. Their ego immediately mobilizes to protect its status, searching for reasons why your order is wrong, impractical, or unfair. But when you ask a targeted, open-ended question, something entirely different happens inside their mind. The human brain cannot resist a question. Instead of raising emotional shields, the brain immediately goes to work searching for an answer. You shift their mental energy from defensive pushback to active problem solving. Mentioned, consider how Dale Carnegie highlighted the legendary methods of Dwight D. Eisenhower, one of the greatest military strategists and leaders of the 20th century. Eisenhower was tasked with commanding dynamic, stubborn, and fiercely independent Allied generals, men with massive egos who despised taking orders from anyone. Had Eisenhower tried to rule with an iron fist, the coalition would have fractured into bitter infighting. Instead, his signature leadership tool was remarkably simple. Before making major strategic moves, he would sit down with his generals and ask, "What do you think is the best way to handle this objective?" Lemje. By asking for their counsel, Eisenhower did two powerful things simultaneously. First, he satisfied their deep psychological craving for self-importance and respect. Second, when the generals proposed solutions, those solutions became their ideas. They were no longer executing an order handed down by a superior. They were passionately carrying out a plan they had helped design. They owned the outcome. The commitment was absolute because their own pride and intellectual investment were on the line. This simple shift in framing changes everything in everyday human interactions. When you tell a struggling team member, "Fix this report by 5 o'clock, you create immediate tension, stress, and quiet resentment. They feel micromanaged and untrusted. But when you reframe the entire situation and ask, how do you think we can optimize this report before the end of the day? You suddenly invite them to step into a position of responsibility. You treat them like an expert rather than a tool. You hand them the steering wheel. And in doing so, you inspire them to drive the project forward with pride rather than reluctance. And furthermore, asking questions grants people the irreplaceable dignity of saving face. Nothing destroys morale faster or breeds deeper hatred than public humiliation or aggressive confrontation. When a leader forcefully points out a mistake, the instinct of the worker is to deny, minimize, or deflect blame onto others. But when you approach an error with genuine curiosity and empathy, asking, "What do you feel caused this oversight? And how can we prevent it next time?" you strip away the fear of punishment. You make it safe for them to be honest, take responsibility, and correct their own mistakes without feeling degraded. This is the hidden key to influencing stubborn personalities People rarely resist their own conclusions. When you dictate the path, they focus on the rocks in the road. When you guide them to discover the path themselves, they focus entirely on reaching the destination. You must learn to suppress your own natural urge to be the smartest person in the room, to prove yourself right, or to demand immediate submission. True influence requires the subtle discipline of letting others take the spotlight while you quietly direct the current beneath the surface. Champions, as you begin to master this craft, you will notice a miraculous shift in how people respond to your presence. The defensive posturing disappears. The passive-aggressive pushback evaporates. People who were once known as unmanageable and rebellious suddenly become your most dedicated, proactive allies. They are not following you because they have to, they are following you because you have given them the freedom to choose. And in doing so, made them feel like the architects of their own success. But to unlock the highest level of this persuasive power, you must master the art of planting seeds so deeply that the other person genuinely believes the brilliance was theirs all along. People rarely resist their own conclusions. When you guide them to discover the path themselves, they focus entirely on reaching the destination. The second core mechanism of invisible leadership lies in the deep human psychological principle of indirect suggestion, the art of planting an idea so subtly that the other person naturally claims ownership of it. Most people spend their lives fiercely defending their own thoughts, while inherently doubting the opinions of others. When you try to sell someone an idea directly, their psychological immune system identifies it as a foreign body and works tirelessly to reject it. But when you allow an idea to germinate organically within their own mind, they will champion it with unshakable conviction. And Dale Carnegie frequently shared the story of a talented interior designer, who struggled for years to sell his sketches to a wealthy, highly particular manufacturer. The designer had brought hundreds of completed concepts to the manufacturer's office, efforts only to have them routinely criticized and rejected. The manufacturer was an arrogant, dominant personality who insisted on doing things his own way. Realizing that direct persuasion was a dead end, the designer changed his strategy entirely. He took several unfinished, rough sketches to the manufacturer's office and said, "I want you to do me a favor. Here are a few incomplete designs. Would you mind telling me how we can finish them so they meet your exact standards?" The manufacturer looked over the rough sketches, took a pencil, and began adding his own ideas, modifications, and notes directly onto the paper. He told the designer to leave the sketches with him. A few days later, the manufacturer called the designer back, fully approved the finalized concepts, and ordered them built immediately. Why did the outcome change so drastically? Because the manufacturer was no longer being sold someone else's work. The finished product felt like his own creation. He had been given the authority, the creative control, and the ego satisfaction of bringing the idea to life. The designer didn't care who received the credit. He cared only about achieving the result. To apply this principle effectively, you must conquer one of the greatest obstacles in human communication, your own desire for personal glory. The moment you demand recognition for an idea, you set up an ego competition with the person you are trying to lead. You force them to choose between accepting your brilliance or protecting their own pride. But when you selflessly detach your ego from the achievement, when you weave another person's name, thoughts, or past comments into the framework of the solution, You eliminate every trace of friction. You allow them to embrace the project with enthusiasm because taking action feeds their self-esteem rather than diminishing it. Consider how this trust. When faced with an uncooperative colleague or stubborn partner, instead of listing the reasons why they ought to change their behavior, remind them of their own highest values. Highlight their past generosity, their reputation for fairness, or their track record of making wise decisions. Frame your request not as a demand for change, but as an opportunity for them to live up to the high standard they have already set for themselves. Human beings carry a powerful subconscious drive to remain consistent with their self-image. When you give someone a fine reputation to live up to, they will go to extraordinary lengths to prove you right. Andy, this is the profound paradox of true influence. The less you attempt to force your will upon others, the more power you actually exercise. By stepping back, listening intently, and letting others shine in the spotlight, you quietly control the atmosphere. You cease being a source of stress or intimidation and become a trusted catalyst for their own potential. But to sustain this momentum over the long haul, you must understand the most potent fuel for human performance. A force far more powerful than money, fear, or obligation. The moment you demand recognition for an idea, you set up an ego competition with the person you are trying to lead. That fuel is the deep, fundamental human hunger for sincere appreciation. In our relentless drive for results, we often forget that human beings do not run on criticism, pressure, or empty directives. They run on validation. There is a vast, vital difference between cheap, manipulative flattery and authentic, specific praise. Flattery comes from the teeth out. It is shallow, self-serving, and easily seen through by anyone with basic emotional intelligence. Authentic appreciation, however, comes from a place of genuine observation. It costs you nothing to give, yet it carries more psychological value than almost any material reward you could ever offer. Dale Carnegie observed that one of the most neglected principles in human relationships is the simple act of praising the slightest improvement and praising every improvement. Think about how most people lead. They remain completely silent when things go right, taking good performance entirely for granted, but the second something strays off course, they descend with sharp, immediate criticism. This creates a culture rooted in anxiety, where people work solely to avoid punishment rather than to achieve greatness. They become risk-averse, quiet, and deeply defensive. If you want to transform a difficult, resistant individual into a loyal, high-performing ally, you must flip this toxic dynamic entirely on its head. Catch them doing something right. Look for the small, overlooked efforts they make. The extra care they put into a minor detail, the moments they manage their temper under stress, or the quiet initiative they take without being asked. When you call out these moments publicly and specifically, something remarkable occurs in their brain. The reward centers light up, releasing dopamine and reinforcing that positive behavior deep within their subconscious identity. And when you praise someone's specific strength, you aren't just making them feel good in the moment, you're actively shaping the future behavior. You are handing them a mirror that shows the absolute best version of themselves. Once a person realizes that you see them as capable, reliable, and exceptional, they will work relentlessly to maintain that reputation in your eyes. Their ego becomes tied to maintaining that high standard. They no longer need to be nudged, managed, or reminded to do their work because their drive is now powered from within. However, a critical challenge arises when corrective action becomes unavoidable. How do you address a glaring mistake or serious performance issue without shattering their morale or triggering that familiar destructive pushback. The secret lies in how you structure your feedback. Never follow a compliment with the word but. The word but immediately cancels out everything positive you just said, signaling to the listener that your praise was merely a trick to soften the blow. Instead, replace that single word with an. Lend it. Instead of saying, "You did a fantastic job on this presentation, but your sales numbers are still too low," reframe it entirely. "You did a fantastic job on this presentation. And if we apply that exact same focus to your sales targets next week, your results will be unstoppable." Do you feel the monumental shift in emotional energy? The first approach triggers immediate defense and disappointment. The second approach builds confidence, maintains dignity, and directs their energy toward the solution with zero friction. Mastering this delicate balance of relentless appreciation and constructive reframing grants you an extraordinary level of influence. You cease to be seen as a boss, a critic, or an adversary. You become a trusted mentor who elevates everyone in your sphere. People will naturally gravitate toward your presence because you make them feel larger, more capable, and more valuable than they felt before meeting you. But to tie all these powerful principles together into an unshakable, lifelong mastery, you must understand the final, ultimate key to human persuasion. Once a person realizes that you see them as capable and exceptional, they will work relentlessly to maintain that reputation in your eyes. The final, ultimate key to influencing those who despise control is mastering the art of radical empathy, seeing the world through their eyes with absolute clarity. The vast majority of interpersonal friction, rebellion, and hostility stems from a single universal tragedy. Human beings rarely stop to consider what the other person truly wants. We enter conversations armed to the teeth with our own goals, our own deadlines, and our own desires. We speak entirely in terms of what we need, completely blind to the fact that the person sitting across from us does not care about our priorities. They care about their own safety, their own peace of mind, their own status, and their own growth. M.G. Dale Carnegie summarized this timeless truth in a simple, profound statement: there is only one way under high heaven to get anybody to do anything, and that is by making the other person want to do it. To unlock that willing desire, you must abandon your ego and relentlessly ask yourself one simple question. Before you open your mouth, why should this person want to do what I am asking? What is in it for them? How does this align with their values, their ambitions, or their emotional security? When you frame every idea, project, or direction in terms of the other person's interests, resistance instantly dissolves into genuine enthusiasm. Remember, think of how this shifts your entire presence in any room. You are no longer viewed as an authority figure pushing an agenda. You become perceived as an advocate, a partner who understands their unspoken needs and opens doors for their personal success. When people realize that following your lead directly serves their own highest good, obedience is no longer enforced from the outside. It becomes a voluntary choice, driven by their own internal ambition. You stop managing people and start inspiring them to lead themselves. This is the hidden mechanics of human motivation. Force can capture a person's body for a few hours, but empathy and strategic influence capture their heart, mind, and loyalty forever. When you stop barking commands, stop demanding credit, and stop trying to win meaningless arguments, you inherit a quiet, massive power that few people in the modern world ever get to experience. So, you become the rare kind of leader whom people gladly follow, not because they are required to, not worthy to be, but because they are elevated, respected, and transformed in your presence. Bend. As you step back into your daily life, remember that every person you meet is fighting an invisible battle to feel significant, understood, and autonomous. Respect their boundaries, nourish their self-esteem with authentic praise, guide them with thoughtful questions, and give them full ownership of the victory. When you master these timeless Dale Carnegie principles, you will never need to force anyone to do anything ever again. You will simply point toward the horizon and watch them eagerly build the road to get there. When people realize that following your lead directly serves their own highest good, obedience becomes a voluntary choice driven by their own ambition.